The bell over the bakery door jingled, and Clara, Mae Dawson, looked up from the counter where she was carefully arranging fresh loaves of bread. The morning sun slanted through the window, catching the flour dust that hung in the air like tiny flecks of snow. She expected to see the Miller boys coming in for penny candy, or perhaps Mrs. Henshaw, who always ordered a half-dozen biscuits. Instead, she saw Luke McAllister, and beside him, tugging eagerly at his hand, was his little girl, Emily. Clara's breath caught. Luke rarely came into town, let alone into her bakery. He was the kind of man people whispered about, the rancher with the weather-worn skin, the steady hands, and the sorrow in his eyes. He was everything Clara felt she wasn't. Admired, respected, wanted. "Daddy cookies," Emily exclaimed, her curls bouncing as she pulled free and ran toward the glass case. Her small hands pressed against it, her face lighting up at the rows of chocolate chip, sugar, and oatmeal raisin. Clara smiled, her nerves softening at the sight of the child. "Well now, aren't you a sweet little thing?" she said warmly, kneeling so she was eye level with Emily. "Do you like chocolate chip?" Emily nodded vigorously. Luke cleared his throat. "She doesn't need." But Clara had already slipped a cookie onto a napkin and handed it to the girl. "First one's on me," she said with a wink. "Baker's rule." Emily giggled and took a bite, chocolate smearing her chin. Her laughter rang through the bakery like a song Clara hadn't known she needed to hear. Luke watched quietly, his expression unreadable. Then, after a long pause, he said, "We'll take a dozen for the ranch hands." Clara wrapped them carefully, sliding the package across the counter. For a moment, her hand brushed his. His skin was rough from years of work, but warm. She quickly pulled back, her cheeks flushing. "Thank you," Luke said simply, tipping his hat before guiding Emily out the door. And just like that, the bakery felt empty again. But Clara's heart beat faster than it had in years. Supper invitation. The visits began to happen more often. Some days Luke would stop by alone. Other times Emily would burst in first, her eyes sparkling. Clara started saving the freshest cookies for her, pretending it was coincidence, though Emily always seemed to know the truth. One afternoon, as Clara packed a loaf of rye bread into a sack, Luke lingered by the counter longer than usual. He shifted his weight, cleared his throat, and finally said, "Clara, I wonder if you'd join us for supper tomorrow. Nothing fancy, just me and Emily at the ranch." Clara froze, the loaf slipping slightly in her hand. Supper at Luke McAllister's ranch. Her first instinct was to refuse. She could already imagine the whispers if anyone saw her wagon heading out toward his land. People would laugh, say she was chasing after something she could never have. But then she remembered Emily's bright eyes, the way she'd crawled into Clara's lap one afternoon with a picture book and asked her to read. Clara couldn't bring herself to say no. "I'd like that," she said softly, almost surprising herself. Luke nodded once, as if relieved. "Tomorrow then, around 6. As he left, Clara stood behind the counter, her heart thudding like a drum. Address and doubts. The next evening, Clara stood in front of her small mirror, tugging at the plain dress she'd chosen. It was soft blue, with a simple sash around the waist. No matter how she smoothed it, the fabric clung in places she wished it wouldn't. "You're a fool," she whispered to her reflection. "He invited you out of politeness. Nothing more." But then she heard her mother's voice in her memory, gentle and reassuring. "Clara, you are more than what the world sees. Don't hide your heart." With trembling hands, she tied her hair back in a loose braid, picked up a basket of sweet rolls, and set off for the ranch. The ride out was quiet, the evening sky glowing gold as the sun dipped toward the horizon. When she reached the sprawling house, Luke was on the porch, wiping his hands on a rag. Emily burst through the door moments later, running to meet her. "Miss Clara," she cried, throwing her arms around Clara's waist. The meal was simple: roast beef, potatoes, cornbread. Clara sat at the table across from Luke, Emily between them. Luke ate in silence, his manner polite but reserved. Clara fumbled with her fork, her nerves rising again. She wondered if she'd made a mistake. What if he only invited her out of pity? What if the whispers in town were right, that she was reaching above her place? The silence grew heavy. Then Emily climbed into Clara's lap with a book in her small hands. "Will you read?" she asked. Clara glanced at Luke, who gave a small nod. She opened the book and began to read, giving each character a silly voice, deep and booming for the bear, squeaky for the rabbit, drawling for the turtle. Emily giggled uncontrollably, clutching her sides. In her laughter, the silence broke. Clara looked up and saw Luke watching her, not with pity, but with something softer, something that made her cheeks burn. For the first time in years, she felt seen. When the evening ended, Luke walked her to her wagon. The night was cool, the stars beginning to blink awake above them. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly. "Thank you for inviting me," Clara replied. Her hands gripped the basket tightly, her heart pounding. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence between them was no longer heavy, but something else, something almost hopeful. As Clara rode home beneath the wide Texas sky, her heart felt lighter than it had in years. She knew the town would talk. She knew whispers would follow. But she also knew something had shifted that night at the McAllister Ranch. And as she glanced up at the stars, she thought, maybe, just maybe, kindness and courage could rewrite her story after all. The morning after supper at the McAllister Ranch, Clara Mae Dawson felt as though she were walking on air. She replayed the evening over and over in her mind. The way Emily had curled in her lap with a storybook, the sound of the little girl's unrestrained laughter, and, most of all, the quiet way Luke had watched her as if, for the first time in her life, she wasn't invisible. It wasn't a declaration of love. It wasn't even a promise. But to Clara, it was enough to ignite a spark of hope she had nearly extinguished. She woke early, tied her hair back with a ribbon, and set about her work at the bakery with a hum on her lips. The smell of cinnamon and sugar filled the air, and she smiled at each customer who walked through her door, her heart light and alive. But in Willow Creek, joy never went unnoticed for long. By the time the sun reached its height, the whispers had begun. Mrs. Henshaw leaned over her basket of eggs at the market and whispered to Mrs. Turner, "Did you hear? Clara was out at Luke McAllister's ranch last night. Supper, they say." Mrs. Turner raised her eyebrows, her mouth curling in disbelief. "Her? With him? Don't be ridiculous. I saw her wagon myself." Another woman chimed in. "Drove out there just before dusk. Stayed past dark." The whispers grew. By evening, they had taken root like weeds. Clara had always been the subject of gossip. Her weight, her singleness, her kindness that some mistook for desperation. But this was different. Now she was linked with Luke McAllister, the most eligible man in town. And to many, it was unthinkable. She'll never be good enough for him. She's desperate, that's all. He's probably just being polite. The laughter came next. Harsh, mocking, cruel. Men chuckled too loudly at the saloon. Women covered their smirks behind lace fans at the mercantile. Even children, parroting their parents, pointed at Clara as she walked down the street. By Sunday morning, when Clara dressed in her best blue gown and made her way to church, she could feel the weight of every stare, every smirk, every whispered word. Clara's hands trembled as she adjusted her shawl. She had always known the church pews to be a place of refuge, but today, each step down the aisle felt like a gauntlet. She heard the sharp intake of breath from the women in the front row, the snickers from the back. "Look at her," someone muttered. "Thinks she's found herself a husband. She'll be laughed off before long." Clara's cheeks burned, but she kept her chin high. She clutched her hymnal as though it were a shield, her knuckles white against the leather. She slid into her usual pew, eyes fixed on the altar, praying silently for strength. Then the doors opened. Luke McAllister stepped inside, tall and steady, his hat in his hand. But it wasn't him that drew every eye in the church. It was Emily skipping at his side, her curls bouncing with each step. The whispers surged again, louder now. "Of course he brought the girl. Doesn't mean anything. She'll never be part of that family." Clara bowed her head, wishing she could disappear into the wood of the pew. She braced herself for the ridicule that always followed, for the snide remarks dressed as polite greetings. But then Emily broke free from her father's hand, the moment that changed everything. "Miss Clara," Her voice rang through the church, bright and clear. Clara's head shot up in surprise as Emily ran straight into her arms, flinging herself against her with a hug so fierce it nearly knocked the hymnal from her hands. Clara held her instinctively, her eyes wide, her heart pounding. The church fell silent. Emily looked up at her father, her voice carrying in the hushed stillness. "She is pretty, Daddy." The words echoed, sharp and pure, slicing through the thick air of judgment like a blade of truth. Pretty. Not kind, not sweet, not helpful. Pretty. The very word Clara had been denied her whole life, spoken aloud in the innocence of a child's honesty. Gasps fluttered through the pews. A few women pressed their lips together, their eyes darting away. A man coughed uncomfortably. The cruel laughter that had been simmering vanished into a stunned silence. Clara's eyes filled with tears. She tried to speak, but her throat closed around the words. She glanced at Luke, expecting to see embarrassment, perhaps even discomfort. But his gaze was steady. His eyes, usually guarded, softened as he looked at her. Slowly, deliberately, he placed a hand on Clara's shoulder. That simple gesture spoke louder than words. He wasn't ashamed. He wasn't hiding. He was standing beside her. The service went on, but the air in the chapel was changed. The whispers were muted, the smirks gone. Clara sat through the hymns with Emily nestled against her side, the warmth of Luke's steady presence behind her. When the congregation spilled into the sunlight afterward, people looked at Clara differently. Some avoided her gaze, their faces flushed with guilt. Others looked curious, uncertain, as if seeing her for the first time. Not everyone's heart shifted that morning. Some still clung to their cruelty. But for the first time, Clara felt the tide begin to turn. Not because she had defended herself, not because she had argued her worth, but because of the unfiltered truth spoken by a child who loved her. That evening, Clara sat at her window, the sunset painting the sky in hues of gold and rose. Her heart was still tender, her mind replaying Emily's words again and again. "She's pretty, Daddy." Tears slid down her cheeks, but for once they weren't born of pain. They were born of healing, of something long denied to her finally being returned. For years, she had been laughed off, dismissed, overlooked. But now, because of the pure eyes of a little girl, she had been called what she had always longed to be, pretty. And more than that, she had been defended. In that moment, Clara realized that beauty wasn't something the town could grant her or deny her. It was something seen in acts of love, spoken in truth, lived in kindness. The laughter had cut deep, but the words of a child had healed deeper still. Clara Mae Dawson never imagined her life would lead here, standing in front of the mirror in a small upstairs room of the church, a white dress flowing around her, her heart trembling with both fear and gratitude. The years of cruel whispers, the mocking laughter, the endless reminders of what she was not, too big, too plain, too unwanted, had once convinced her that love was something she was not meant for. But as she lifted her gaze and saw her own reflection framed in soft lace, she realized she no longer recognized the woman staring back. Not because she was thinner or dressed differently, but because she finally saw herself through the eyes of those who truly loved her. She saw herself the way Emily had when she tugged on her father's sleeve and declared, "She is pretty, Daddy." Downstairs, the church filled with neighbors and townsfolk. Some came out of curiosity, still incredulous that Luke McAllister, the steady, respected cowboy of Willow Creek, had chosen Clara as his bride. Others came because their hearts had been quietly softened over the months, changed by the small ways Clara's strength and kindness had begun to ripple through the town. Mothers remembered the way she knelt to speak kindly to their children. Families thought of the pies and cookies she had given freely to those who couldn't pay. Men who had once laughed at her now looked away in quiet shame, remembering the way Luke had stood up for her and the way Emily had spoken the truth they had refused to see. As Clara stood waiting, the door opened and Emily came rushing in, a basket of wildflowers in her hands. "Miss Clara," she cried breathlessly, "you look like a real princess." The little girl's eyes sparkled as she pressed the flowers into Clara's hands. Don't be scared. Everyone's going to see how beautiful you are today. Tears pricked Clara's eyes. She knelt, pulling the child into her arms, whispering, I'm not scared anymore, sweetheart. Because you helped me remember who I really am. Emily hugged her tightly, then ran back out, her laughter trailing behind her like music. The music began, and Clara's heart thundered as she stepped into the aisle. For a moment, the weight of every stare pressed on her. She thought of all the years she had dreaded gatherings like this, afraid of the ridicule that came whenever she dared to step into the light. But then her eyes found Luke at the altar, steady and sure, his gaze holding hers as if she were the only soul in the room. The whispers and doubts melted away. Step by step, Clara walked forward, her chin lifted, her shoulders squared. She wasn't walking as the woman the town had laughed at. She was walking as the woman she had grown into, strong and unashamed. The vows were simple but full of truth. Luke's voice was low and unwavering when he said, Clara, I don't care what this town once said. I don't care what they'll say tomorrow. I know who you are, and I know what you mean to me and to Emily. You've given us laughter again, and warmth, and the kind of love I thought I'd lost forever. I promise to honor you all my days. When it was Clara's turn, her hands trembled, but her voice carried clear. Luke, you show me that love is not earned by how we look, but by how we live and how we give. You've given me back the courage I thought I had lost. I vow to love you and Emily with all that I am, for as long as God gives me breath. The pastor smiled, and when Luke kissed her, the church erupted into applause. Not mocking, not cruel, but real. It wasn't just approval of their union. It was something deeper, a collective acknowledgement that they had been wrong about her, wrong about what beauty meant, wrong about what love could look like. That evening, the town gathered at the McAllister Ranch for the wedding supper. Long tables stretched across the yard, covered in pies and stews and roasted meats. Lanterns hung from the trees, casting golden light across the crowd. Clara moved among the guests, greeting them with the same warmth she had always carried. But this time something was different. People met her eyes. They smiled back. They thanked her. And though some still held on to old prejudices, there was no denying that the tide had turned. Halfway through the night, one of the very women who had once laughed loudest at her came forward, her hands twisting nervously. Clara, she began, her voice low, I wanted to say I'm sorry. I was wrong about you. Clara looked at her for a long moment, then smiled gently. Thank you, she said simply. It was not forgiveness that cost her much to give. She had already chosen to let go of the bitterness years ago. But hearing it spoken aloud was a gift she hadn't expected. The children of the town flocked around Emily, who led them in dancing and laughter. At one point, the little girl grabbed Clara's hand and pulled her into the circle. Dance with us, Miss Clara, she cried. And so Clara danced, laughing freely, her dress swirling, her cheeks flushed with joy. The people of Willow Creek looked on and saw something they could no longer deny. Happiness, real and unshakable, blooming in the woman they had once dismissed. As the stars filled the sky, Clara slipped away to the porch, taking a quiet moment for herself. Luke joined her, slipping his arm around her shoulders. For a long while, they said nothing, just watched the lanterns flicker and the children chase fireflies. Then Luke spoke softly. You know, Clara, you didn't just change my life. You changed this whole town. They're better for knowing you. Clara leaned her head against his shoulder, tears welling again. I didn't set out to change anyone. I just wanted to be kind, even when they weren't. Luke kissed her hair and whispered, That's exactly why you did. The sound of Emily's laughter rang across the yard, and Clara's heart swelled. She thought back to all the nights she had sat alone in her little bakery, believing her life would never be more than work and whispers. She thought of the sting of cruel words, the heaviness of loneliness, the ache of being unseen. And now, here she was, wife, mother, beloved, not because she had ever changed to fit the world's shallow standards, but because she had stayed true to her heart. The laughter that once cut her down had been replaced with joy. The whispers had become apologies, and her story had become a reminder to everyone watching that beauty is not a size. Love is not a privilege reserved for a chosen few, and kindness has the power to transform even the coldest hearts. Clara Mae Dawson, once the woman the town laughed at, had become the bride who changed them all. And as she stood on that porch, the night wrapped around her like a blessing, she whispered to herself with a quiet smile, "She is pretty, Daddy." The words no longer needed to be spoken by anyone else. They lived in her now, steady and sure. And for the first time in her life, she believed them. Because beauty had never been about what others could see. It had always been about the love she carried, the kindness she gave, and the courage to keep standing tall when the world tried to push her down. That was the gift she gave the town, to Luke, to Emily, and finally to herself. And that truth, shining brighter than the lanterns, would remain long after the wedding feast was done. The heart is where true beauty lives, and once you learn to see it, it has the power to change the world. Clara Mae Dawson had always been the kind of woman people noticed, but not for the reasons she longed for. In a small town like Willow Creek, where everybody knew everybody and no secret stayed hidden for long, Clara's size was the first thing most people saw. She was larger than most women her age, round in the face, soft in her middle, and broad in her shoulders. And people, cruel as they sometimes are, made sure she never forgot it. From the time Clara was a little girl, whispers trailed her like a shadow. At church picnics, she heard the giggles when she reached for a second biscuit. At school, boys mimicked the way her chair creaked under her. By the time she was a young woman, those whispers had hardened into assumptions. She'll never find a husband. She's sweet but not pretty. She'll end up old and alone. Clara smiled anyway. She learned to laugh when others laughed at her, though the sound often caught in her throat when she was alone. She wore her heart like an open door, offering kindness to everyone who crossed her path, even when they didn't deserve it. And while other women married young, raised children, and built homes, Clara poured her love into the town's bakery, the little shop her late mother had left her. It was there that Clara truly came alive. Every morning before dawn, she rolled dough with strong hands and dusted flour across the worn wooden counters. By the time the sun stretched across the horizon, the air in the bakery swirled with the smell of cinnamon rolls, golden bread, and sweet apple pies. The townsfolk came not just for the pastries, but for Clara herself. She knew everyone by name. She remembered which farmer liked his loaf unsliced, which widow preferred extra frosting on her cakes, which child saved pennies for gumdrops. For the children, Clara had a special rule. If a little one came into her bakery with empty pockets and hopeful eyes, she always found a way to slip them something sweet. "Don't tell anyone," she'd whisper, placing a cookie into their tiny hands. "This one's just between us." The children always giggled and nodded solemnly, though everyone in town knew Clara's secret generosity. To many, she was the big girl with a kind heart. But what they didn't see, what they chose not to see, was that behind Clara's warmth was a woman who longed to be loved for more than just her kindness. At night, when the bakery lights dimmed and the streets of Willow Creek fell quiet, Clara would climb the narrow stairs to her little apartment above the shop. She'd sit at the window with a cup of tea, looking out at the stars, wondering if somewhere in the wide world there was someone who could look at her and see more than her size. Someone who might hold her hand, not out of pity, but out of love. But Willow Creek was not a place where dreams like that seemed to come true. Men passed her by. Suitors danced with slimmer girls at barn socials. And though people praised her pies and her kindness, Clara sometimes felt invisible in the way that hurt most deeply. Not unseen, but unseen in the way that matters. And yet, despite it all, she never let bitterness take root. Clara believed that kindness was the only way forward, even when kindness wasn't returned. She chose, day after day, to live with a heart open wide. She had no idea that this choice, her stubborn, unshakable kindness, was about to change her life in a way the town of Willow Creek would never forget. Because in the same dusty town, just a few miles beyond the bakery, there lived a cowboy named Luke McAllister. Luke was everything Clara thought she wasn't. Strong, handsome, quiet. He was the kind of man people respected without question. After his father's passing, he had taken over the sprawling McAllister Ranch, a piece of land so vast it seemed to stretch right into the horizon. People admired him, even envied him. Women whispered about him the way they never whispered about Clara, about his broad shoulders, his steady hands, his lonely widower's heart. Luke had lost his wife years ago, leaving him to raise his little girl, Emily, alone. He was devoted to her, working from sunup to sundown to provide, but there was a loneliness in his eyes that no one dared speak of. And though the townsfolk liked to guess which woman Luke might one day choose, surely it'll be someone beautiful, someone slender, someone worthy of his name. No one would have imagined that his path would cross with Clara's in the way it did. It began one ordinary spring morning, with a little girl tugging her father's hand and pointing toward the bakery's open door. "Daddy, cookies!" Emily cried, her curls bouncing as she pulled him inside. And in that small, flour-dusted shop, the cowboy and his daughter met the woman everyone saw, but no one truly knew. The morning after church, Clara Mae Dawson stepped out of her little bakery with her head held higher than she had in years. The whispers of the town had not disappeared overnight, but something inside her had changed. Emily's voice still echoed in her ears. "She is pretty, Daddy." Those words, simple and pure, had carved themselves into her heart, steadying her steps as she walked across the dusty street. For the first time, she did not shrink from the stairs. She did not hurry past the gossip. She let herself be seen. At the general store, two women stood whispering by the door, their eyes flicking toward her as she approached. Clara met their gaze with a gentle smile, not sharp or defensive, just steady. To her surprise, one of the women looked away, cheeks flushing with something that looked a lot like shame. Clara realized then that strength wasn't always loud. It could be quiet too. It was in the way you carried yourself when the world tried to bend you. Life in Willow Creek didn't transform overnight. There were still cruel chuckles behind her back, still careless words that stung. But there were also moments of kindness she hadn't expected. Old Mr. Harlan, who usually kept his greetings short, tipped his hat to her on Main Street and said, "Mornin', Miss Dawson. Fine day, ain't it?" Children who once mimicked their parents' laughter now tugged at their mother's skirts and asked for Clara's sugar cookies. Even small acts of recognition felt like cracks of sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Luke McAllister began stopping by the bakery more often, always with Emily skipping at his side. He'd lean against the counter, his deep voice steady, asking about her day, about her dreams for the little shop she'd worked so hard to keep alive. Sometimes Emily would tug Clara's apron and ask for stories, and Clara would kneel down, telling tales of brave princesses who weren't chosen because of their beauty, but because of their hearts. Luke always listened quietly, his eyes never mocking, his presence never heavy. It was as if he understood that Clara had spent a lifetime being overlooked, and he was determined to see her fully. Still, doubt gnawed at her. One evening, after closing the bakery, Clara sat by the window, staring at her reflection in the glass. Her hands rested on her lap, and she whispered, "Pretty, am I really?" She had been told otherwise so many times it seemed foolish to believe it now. Yet the echo of Emily's voice pushed back the darkness. She thought of how the child's little arms had wrapped around her, how her eyes had lit up with love that saw past everything else. Children didn't lie about such things. They spoke the truth as they saw it, unfiltered and raw. If Emily saw her as pretty, maybe she could dare to see herself that way, too. The following week brought the Harvest Festival, one of the busiest events in Willow Creek. Clara had prepared trays upon trays of pumpkin pies, spiced cookies, and apple tarts. She arrived at the town square early, her cart loaded, her heart trembling. Festivals had always been the hardest for her. Crowds meant more laughter, more judgment, more eyes lingering too long. She considered turning back, but then Emily's voice rose in her memory again, steadying her spine. She would not hide. Not anymore. She set up her table, arranging her baked goods carefully. At first, people walked by without stopping, their glances flickering with old prejudice. But slowly, drawn by the rich scent of cinnamon and sugar, they began to gather. A child bit into one of her cookies and gasped, "Mama, it's the best I ever had." Soon a line formed, and Clara found herself smiling, greeting each customer warmly, offering more than just pastries, offering kindness in every word, every gesture. It happened. A group of young men, emboldened by one another's presence, laughed too loudly as they passed. "Look there," one of them sneered. "The baker lady's feeding the whole town, and herself, too." Their laughter rang sharp in the autumn air, cutting through Clara's fragile confidence. For a moment, the old shame surged back, threatening to crush her. She felt her cheeks burn, her hands tremble. The crowd grew quiet, eyes darting to see how she would respond. Before she could gather herself, Emily's small voice cut through the silence. The little girl had been sitting at her father's booth nearby, but now she marched right up to the young man, her chin lifted high. "Don't laugh at Miss Clara," she declared. "She's the nicest lady in town, and she's pretty too." Gasps rippled through the square. The men froze, stunned by the child's boldness. Clara's heart swelled and broke at the same time, tears threatening to spill. Luke was at Emily's side in a heartbeat, his jaw tight as he looked at the men. "You boys ought to be ashamed," he said, his voice like iron. "A man who laughs at a woman to make himself feel bigger is no man at all." The crowd shifted, murmurs rising. A few people clapped softly. Others looked away, embarrassed. The young men, red-faced and humiliated, muttered excuses and slunk off. The square grew quiet again, but this time the silence wasn't heavy with cruelty. It was charged with something else, something stronger. Respect. Clara stood a little taller. Not because Emily had defended her, not because Luke had spoken, but because, in that moment, she realized she was no longer fighting alone. She had allies now. She had love, pure and unfiltered, shining from a child's eyes, and respect growing in the quiet strength of a cowboy's stance. The cruelty of others still stung, but it no longer defined her. She was learning to define herself. That night, after the festival, Clara walked home with her empty trays stacked high and her heart fuller than it had ever been. The stars stretched across the sky, and she whispered a prayer of thanks, not for the change in the town, but for the change in herself. She had stood tall. She had faced the laughter and the whispers, and she was still standing, stronger than before. And as she drifted to sleep, she held on to the truth that had been planted in her by a child's innocent words. Beauty was not a gift granted by others. It was something she carried within her, something no laughter could ever take away. Sometimes the most powerful courage is found not in defiance, but in standing tall with quiet grace. Sometimes the world needs a child's voice to remind it of what is true. And sometimes when love begins to take root, it gives even the weariest soul the strength to rise and keep walking. For Clara Mae Dawson, the laughter that once cut her down was no longer the end of her story. It was only the beginning of her rise.